we started, we kind of put the ideas together of what we wanted to tell in it toward the latter part of 2010. And then we had the great good fortune of getting funding from one source, which was Universal, which is a really brave and you know, they deserve, I think, just tremendous applause for kind of doing the kind of movie that studios don't do right now. And, you know, it's a small budget, so it wasn't like a giant monetary risk, but nonetheless, it was something that we were really quite grateful for. And then we set about doing it. I mean, it started with talking to Julian's legal representatives. Then, you know, we brought on Jemima Khan as an executive producer, who was one of the most, I would say, most famous of the public faces in Julian's camp in the early days of his notoriety. And Jemima was helping with access. There were some other people we were dealing with that were helping with access. You know, Alex met with Julian, I would say, at least a half a dozen times. What's shown in the film was, as Alex says, as only Alex has such a way with words, but as a 5-hour negotiation. So it wasn't the only meeting, but it was the marathon negotiation, and it was actually longer than 5 hours. It went well into the night. And in fact, what isn't actually detailed in the film is at the end of that negotiation, Julian did agree to the interview. It was all set up, the crew was there to shoot him the next morning, and in the middle of the night sent an email to Alex changing his mind. His reticence, and then I'll get to the footage in a second, but his reticence, I think, is, and I mean, I'm fairly confident this is accurate, is due to his concern that we were talking to many people that he wished we weren't talking to. And we know it from just a lot of people that we would hear that from. And so, as Alex said, you know, his real preference was that we would kind of join his club and kind of report back to him on what we learned and heard from those people. And, you know, obviously in the journalistic integrity that Alex had in the film, you know, endeavors to undertake, we couldn't do that. So that was on the 5-hour interview. That was way late in the process. We had already had many meetings with Julian. Alex, in fact, had been invited by him to his 40th birthday party, which he attended. I mean, there's like a lot of interaction, none of which resulted, though, in the interview. And from the beginning, it was clear money was definitely a big issue. I mean, we could have had an interview from day one if we were paying for it. And it's understandable, he was under tremendous financial pressures with his legal problems, as the movie starts to talk about. In terms of the volume of footage that is in the film, you know, a lot of it we shot, and a lot of it we just had a tremendous research team that was scouring the earth for anyone that had ever shot anything involving him. And so we found it on European local television, we found it in Australian television, we found it in, you know, Mark Davis. A lot of it was a trove of material that Mark Davis, who's in the film, had shot when he followed Julian. And Mark had put together really a well-done piece for Australian television about Julian. And what we were able to do, we struck a deal with Mark that to acquire all of his footage. So we were able to go through all of his outs and find just gems of stuff that had never made its way into the light of day. And it's interesting, like when Julian's looking at the newspapers and fawning over the photographs, or when he's, you know, kind of, the guard is down with the makeup artist, or you know, there are just these little moments where I actually think much of his true personality leaks out in a way that you just never get otherwise. So we were really quite fortunate. Some of what we also got at Allingham Hall was literally just buying right from Julian's crew, just the footage that they had shot as his personal videographers. Like, I mean, there's a shot, I came in toward the end of the screen but heard the laughter of the shot of Julian on the trampoline on the cell phone. at the manor. I mean, it's just crazy, surreal, you know, footage. So it was from a lot of different places. And, you know, we did have the kind of funding for a documentary, which is generous, to be able to buy a lot of that footage. So that really did help as well.
Do you think that Julian's ultimate decision not to do the interview was so that it'd be easier to distance himself from the film, or because he was afraid of the questions that would be asked?
You know, the fact that we had spent a lot of time with Daniel Baumscheid-Berg and some other members of his inner circle that he knew about. We also had spent a lot of time in Australia. In fact, there's a lot of Australia that's not in the film that you can see in the DVD extras when the DVD comes out, in which, like, I mean, there is the whole Australia section, but we had a lot more about Australia than actually made it into this cut, as we had to wrangle the length into the form that we wanted to present it as. And just word got back to Julian about, oh, they talked to him, and oh, they were in Magnetic Island where you were born, talking to your neighbor, and oh, you know, his mom got into it, and you know, the nanny, I don't know how many of you actually know the story intimately enough to know of who the character of the nanny is, but there's sort of this figure from Australia who's a professor down there, who's like the person he calls in to clean up his messes. And we, you know, interviewed her, and she was not, I know she reported back to him with, you know, some real, you know, concerns, I think, over how, you know, how probing I think Alex was going to be. And so, you know, I can't say for sure that what's in the mind of anybody who makes a decision to do or do not do something like that.
It seems like this this film is incredibly thorough in the things that it explores, not just his story, but also, keep looking at it, but you know, Bradley Manning's story. But I'm guessing even at this length, there are many things that you guys have discussed that did not wind up being in this cut of the film. Can you tell us about some of the avenues that Alex was trying to explore that might
Sure.
not have made it in?
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, it's just a gigantic story, and it touches upon so much of where we are today, technologically, in so many ways, about, you know, the challenges of a modern democracy in the information era, in which, you know, and who's going to hold institutions of power accountable, and who's going to hold the people who hold those institutions accountable, etc. So, like, we spent a lot of time embedded with Anonymous and the organization, and there was a lot of stuff from Anonymous that we ultimately did not include in the film. Anonymous itself is its own entire movie, to be honest, for somebody to do. I think some people are actually doing it. A fascinating story of, you know, one of the, you know, tricky things about interviewing Anonymous, they always insist on wearing the Guy Fawkes mask, and so there's never any expression. So they'll say the most colorful and fascinating things in that, you know, Guy Fawkes persona, and in the end, the effect is just creepy. And so we didn't. There was a lot of that. There was, as I said, a lot more of an expansive exploration of Julian's early life in Australia that we ended up having to abbreviate. There was there was a lot. There was there was more stuff in Iceland. There was a lot of stuff. But I'm very happy with kind of the job that the whole team did, and Andy Greaves, the editor, and Alex, and kind of bringing it into shape. And it was a long process to bring it into shape.
But there's two things presented about the sort of consequences of the WikiLeaks information in the film. One, there's the suggestion that it's part of the inspiration for things that happened during the Arab Spring. On the other hand, you also go into the basically the State Department and the Department of Defense saying that it didn't really have much actual effect on national security. Tell us a little bit about, those two things, and, whether, what your personal opinion is about the actual long-term effect of what happened.
Well, it's fascinating, and you frame that question, I think, in a really interesting way, because I think an unexpected takeaway from the film is that everybody somehow plays their role in how they interpret the issue. From the institution that they represent or the political ideology that they adhere to. I mean, we all somehow play the role that we're given, and the epitome of that, of course, is Adrian Lamo playing the role of the snitch and wearing the hat that, identifies him as such. So it's just an interesting question. I think one of the really cool things somewhere in the texture of the film that you feel as a viewer. What do I believe is, I believe that, it's what the movie concludes with, which is that WikiLeaks started an incredibly important revolution in transparency, in encouraging, whistleblowers, in knowing that there's a way to protect sources in order to get information out. And the ultimate goal of that is, what I was saying a little bit earlier, which is to hold power accountable. And that's a phenomenally important undertaking and mission, and they deserve, and Julian, as the man who really saw the vision of that, deserves extraordinary credit for that. And I do think that we're not at all, if anything, we're even understating the impact of WikiLeaks at helping to spur some of what happened in Arab Spring, in other movements around the world. But at this point, I think WikiLeaks itself is a wounded and only quasi-functioning organization. But I think the movement itself is as vital today as ever, and will grow, and I think generate all kinds of amazing new organizations that will become the vanguard of transparency. And I think ultimately that's what it's about. And like many, causes, or when you think of explorers who kind of find new continents, that's how I think of Julian. That's not always the person you want to govern, but they deserve a lot of credit for being the brave one who went out there on the edge and found the land, and and kind of did their best to try to colonize it in whatever